La primera chaqueta de gobierno latinoamericano en UK.
Empezamos, ¿eh?
Pues no, la mía no fue mal. Es por
Hi everyone, welcome to our first seminar of the series. Thanks for coming. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Enrique Uribe Jongbloed, who's at the moment he's a research associate in the University of Cardiff in the School of Journalism, Media and Culture, where he's working on as a research associate on this project called Media Kumu, which is I don't know, it's a private company here or something.
It's a consortium between Cardiff University and some companies working in the media sector to develop innovation.
So it's promoting media innovation for Wales. That's what that company does. But at the same time, he's been seconded, I suppose, from the Universidad External de Colombia, where he works as a researcher and lecturer in the School of Communication and Journalism. He's published widely on comics in Colombia, but also on media, citizenship, governance, that kind of thing. His background is in film and TV studies. He did an MA in World Heritage Studies and a PhD in Media Studies in Aerosmith. So I think that's probably enough. And today is going to talk to us about comics in Colombia.
Yeah. Thanks to all of you for coming.
Yeah, we just reduce like this.
So what I want to talk to you today is about the 100 years of comics in Colombia and how that has shown a lot of changes through time in what is now considered to be important for the Colombian comic scene.
Maybe.
No. All right. So when we talk about the 100 years of Colombian comics, it's because of a character that's called Mojicón. But Mojicón, which was published in a newspaper called Mundo al Día, was actually a blatant copy of Smitty, as you just saw a second ago. And you can see that in this case. So it's funny that we start in the Colombian history of comics by plagiarism, basically. So this was a direct copy of a work, but that has been the work of Samper is considered to be the start of Colombian comics. And throughout the 1920s and 30s, he would continue to publish other comics, and they will veer out of copying Smitty and develop other characters. But that was basically how it got started and how it appeared for the first time in Colombia. Colombia had a long tradition of political caricature that started in the mid-19th century. But this is just a moment when we start to talk about comics in general. Very recently, Felipe Osa, who is known as a collectionist of comics and who was the editor of one part of the newspaper El Tiempo for about, that's a national newspaper, for about 20 years. He was the one making sure that there would be comics published in El Tiempo. He mentioned in that book, in which he summarizes the history of comic, in which Colombia only gets, Colombian comics only gets but a very short chapter from that book. He mentioned that in 2019, Colombian comics were just starting, just basically becoming relevant at that point. So it has taken us a while. From those 100 years, only in the last 20, we could say that there's been a large amount of things that happened with comics. It doesn't mean that nothing happened with comics in Colombia, but rather that it's only recently that it has received a lot of attention. Back in the 1960s was probably the heyday of comics in Colombia as a market. There were a lot of people buying comics. Most of these comics were either from the US or from Mexico, some of them from Argentina. But just to highlight how important they were, later on in the 70s, this is a very famous Mexican comic, Fantomas, and because of the large readership in Colombia, Fantomas made it to Colombia in one of the situations. Now, in '64, they tried to make their own Colombian comics by artists that would later on work in different parts of the world. And one of them was El Dago, that you can see over there. El Dago only had one publication. And so did Macu, which is the one that you can see on the right. it was not very successful, even though it was in the same kind of market as all the comics that were being bought at the moment. The Colombian ones made by local artists did not become so relevant, and these artists would go on to draw comics for the Mexican companies mainly. So that was the first kind of attempt to have our own comic back in. Now, during the 80s and 90s, you would get either this kind of small magazine that would appear with the newspaper El Espectador, or you would have a longer page section in El Tiempo, and that was very well known. And I present this particularly because this is, well, from the main story of Tucano, which is the character that you see on the right. And here in this cover is where you can see, the one in the middle, you can see what were at that moment the comics that were made by Colombian artists that appeared in Los Monos. So you could see the Marcianitos on the top right, were quite famous around that time. And you can also see Tucano down in the bottom on the right. Those were the only 5 Colombian comics that were published in Los Monos. The rest were just syndicated, mainly US comic strips that were there. But you would have also Tintin, and you would also have occasionally some Argentinian. I'm not sure in Los Monos, can't remember of any that were Argentinian in Los Monos, but in El Tiempo they would have the works of Fontana Rosa, definitely. So then, bring you up of the 90s and the 20 until 2020, well, we can see that there are many more comics appearing. And there's a number of reasons for that. It's quite interesting that this, which became like a cult magazine in 1993, Acme, was about the same time when Colombia developed a new book law that actually proscribed comics, that mentioned that comics were just like pornography or magazines about gambling, because it was not cultural whatsoever. So that book law that actually provided incentives to publish books by reducing VAT did not cover comics. So comics became more expensive. Already in the 1980s, because of the popularity of comics, there were many people saying that they were bad for children, that they were kind of destroying our culture, some of that moral panic that has happened all over the world with different media and different moments. So they had started to be taxed in the 1980s, and by the 1990s, because of the book law, it did not become a good business to try to sell comics. So very few comics survived past that law. Probably one of the most common ones would be Condorito, the Chilean comic strip. But apart from that, they almost disappeared. It doesn't mean that they totally disappeared, but they certainly were not as common. And the interesting thing, though, at the same time, was the Colombian Cultural Agency, before it became the Ministry of Culture, was the one sponsoring this magazine that was for comics. So it's very curious that at the same time as the book law was banning, basically, or not considering comics to be worth it, the Agency for Culture was actually supporting the development of a magazine that was about comics. It was never market success, sadly, but it was very important for a whole generation of artists that saw in Acme the possibility to publish their comics. And it was very influential to the next group of people that would appear after 2010. Those are all the other comics that you see above. The problem with that legislation was only changed in 2012 when the Constitutional Court of Colombia declared that it was unconstitutional to consider to remove comics from this benefit because they were considered to be cultural goods. So from that point onwards, again, comics could enjoy reduced taxes, and that helped them become more available, or widely available in Colombia, both foreign comics and then the ones produced locally. Very recently, Revista Blast, which has dedicated the work on comics and other graphic material, developed a what they call a critical report on the situation of comics in Colombia, just to show that from 2010 to 2020, you can see an increase in the amount of comics produced. most of them being self-published, as you can see in the other graph there. Although that could certainly be well below the actual number of self-published comics, just because it's so hard to find them and to find copies of them to know how many of them there are. But definitely that is an underreporting of the self-published comics. But it's interesting also to see that the ones by renowned publishers have also increased in time. As a way of showing this kind of disparity between the ones that are more formal than the others, then they say how many of those comics, what percentage of those comics include an ISBN or an ISSN, and which ones do not. And as I mentioned, it's still underrepresenting the number of comics that have come out in the last 10, 20 years. Main things that have changed also imply the comic book scene has changed, and it has become a part of most of the large-scale events in the country. So from the International Book Fair, where comics have now had more space to be shown and to be discussed, where they have gained more notoriety in recent years, to SOFA, Salón del Ocio y la Fantasía, which is an event that usually brought people who are interested mainly in other types of fan participation and games, video games, and other types of entertainment. Comics have always had a big part of that. But funnily enough, we also have Comic-Con, but Comic-Con has very little on comics, particularly on national comics. You can get certain things of international comics, or mainly American ones, but you would get more things about modern entertainment, like streaming and the television and film, that you would get from comics. So funnily enough, the Comic-Con is the one that has the least amount of things regarding comics, at least Colombian comics, even though they do sponsor some talks about comics. Another thing that has been very interesting has been the development of the grassroots events. And here, one that needs to be mentioned is Entre Viñetas, which is a festival that has always gathered a lot of interest and a lot of people into comic books. It is considered by many to be a bit more elegant and more educated than other festivals that are around, but that has always brought some level of attention and some level of recognition, particularly for comics in Colombia. And at the same time, you have other type of festivals like FICO, and FICO is an independent comic book festival that is mainly focused on those kind of independent self-published comics by just young artists. That is one of the main differences. And what I would like to highlight as well is, if you look into what you see mostly being represented in the case of Entre Viñetas, you will get more of what we talk about as a graphic novel. Yeah, they're usually more complex, longer productions. It's what is more commonly shown there. Whereas in FICO, you get this kind of small magazines, self-published, self-printed, that it's more part of the younger comic scene, I would say. One of the things that has been developed together between FICO and others is trying to collect all the Colombian comics. And this is something that they've done as just people who are interested in comics. So FICO, along with other comic book artists, have developed this website, comiccolombiano.com, where you can see most of what has been developed in Colombia. People have to basically add their own comics. And when they were working with 100 years of comics in Colombia, they started developing the possibility for people to upload historical comics. So basically that they could go back and then just take a shot of the cover and then put it up there so that we could recreate a timeline of comics in Colombia. Now, this had already been done in the past by Bernardo Rincón at Universidad Nacional, but the problem is that website has been down for, I think, 6 years now. So there was a need for a new space where you could actually see what kind of comics have been developed. So they're trying to do this, and you can also access the timeline. It's not the most functional things thus far, but the good thing about this website that they've developed is it's creating a database that is going to be open to everyone who is going to study comics. And one of the main problems studying comics thus far has been the access to most of these comics that I mentioned. And for the 100 years of comics in Colombia, there was like an action that was put out there for people to draw their current characters in relation to Mojicón, kind of celebrate that. And that was done through Instagram, and Facebook, and different artists that have created their own comic books added their own characters, as you can see over there. This year there was a development that started kind of a whole new community of people working in comics that was started through WhatsApp, and then developed a Discord channel, which is quite interesting in the things that have been posted and debated there. And it's always very interesting to see how these kind of groups exist. I mean, people who have participated, such as Pablo Guerra and Daniel Jaramillo, who have been involved with Entre Viñetas, for instance, have also participated in all of these. And also Bernardo Rincon, who is probably one of the people who has done more research on comics since the 1990s. So they also participate in there, not as much as many of the others. And there's always big debates and big discussions because it's hard to get all of the people working in comics to agree on anything. But it's interesting just to see how the mechanics of that WhatsApp group has developed, and the fact that they created this Discord channel that actually was based on a page they had on Facebook for many years, but that kind of disappeared. But they had, it was very interesting to see the different generations of artists and creators of comics debating issues on comics and on who should intervene and where the money should come from and the support that they should get from the government. And then the different activities that different groups are doing, or the way that they're channeling some grant money from other places. And that always sparks up debates of who is getting this money in the end. So it has been very interesting how that has worked throughout the last year in that channel. It's an interesting development of a community. But I wanted to bring your attention to this, which is the work that has been done by a colleague of mine, Daniel Aguilar, with Jessica Contreras, who was a former student that became a research assistant. And the most interesting thing about this development of this study that they're doing that has not been published yet, this is just a draft. You're getting here a preview of what is to come. This has been drawn by Daniel himself. So this is his work in trying to turn an article they're developing in which they analyzed the comics from the last 10 years, ever since the peace accords in Colombia. Well, they go back even some years to just see what they can find and what is happening. Because the interesting issue there is both for major publishers, such as Planeta Comics or Cohete, from some of the publishers, they've started to do more and more comics that address and discuss what happened in the Colombian conflict. This also got started because some of the organizations, such as the Centro Nacional de Memoria Histórica, so the National Center for Historic Memory, and also La Comisión de la Verdad, the Commission for Truth, have also created or sponsored them to develop comics to explain or to narrate what has happened in the Colombian conflict. And the reason for that is because they have seen that most people feel more comfortable with seeing their stories as a comic that they do in whether journalistic reports or other type of documents that seem to be too foreign or too strange to them in that sense. So they discover that comics are a good way of narrating the stories that is actually closer to the people who have experienced the impact of the conflict. Now, the interesting thing is that there have been many different ways in which it has been addressed, whether it is including elements of science fiction, which is quite interesting. So how they turn the story of a massacre or the story of the conflict from different perspectives, trying to use different ways of narrating that conflict. And as an example, I have here El Salado, which you can see, in which they are presenting a very well-known massacre that was carried out by the paramilitaries in Colombia. They try to transform the story in a way that is narrated with some kind of sci-fi and monsters that appear and attack the town. So it's an interesting kind of reconstruction of that experience. And that one you can see online. It's available. If you want to. It's really nice, as you can see. It's very good. That's one of the cases. Another one in the case of Liborina, which is telling the story about a group of people who kind of enclosed themselves during the end of during the conflict, and they didn't realize that there was a peace accord or anything else. They lived within that confined area up until other characters come in and encounter them. Is that they bring the news that that conflict that you talk about does not exist anymore, and it's very interesting, this whole situation of how that kind of sci-fi story of how the people from the future then understand what happened there through the experience of these people who segregated themselves from the rest of the world during the conflict. It's quite an interesting one as well. Other cases that are quite interesting from the comics that have appeared are adaptations, and La Vida de Liebre is an adaptation of a theater play, which is quite interesting in that sense that it was adapted into a that is something that probably is the least that I've ever seen in Colombian media, that it's an adaptation into comic of a play. That is probably one of the strangest ones that I've seen. Recetarios Sabor in the Handles, which mixes the idea of getting a recipe book with histories that connect to experiences and parts of the country related to the conflict as well. And El Olvido que Seremos, which is a very famous book that is then adapted as a comic. That is a bit more common that you adapt. And certain books have been adapted to comics in the last couple of years as well, but I thought La Vida Libre was particularly interesting in that sense. There's also other ways in which it has been addressed, as stories being told of those who had to go to exile because conflict or other issues, and others that have used comics as a way of presenting more of a documentary nature of descriptions of situations that have happened. And for that, we have what Altais has done with Altais Comics. So you can also see those, and this is also available online. You can see the whole use that has been presented by Altais in narrating that story. What becomes then very interesting from the work that Daniel and Jessica have done, and this is how it continues. So as I said, you're getting a preview. This is not finished work. It was sent to me to revise and to check with them. But I spoke to them to see if it was okay to show it before it's finished. But they're quite happy with it. So they found it interesting on those comics that they found that were addressing the issue of conflict. How many of them were works of fiction? How many were documentary work? And how many of them were just representing the stories of real people, but changing elements or combining them together for the creation. So it's not quite fiction in the sense that this is telling a true story, but they combine elements of different stories to create those narratives, to make them accessible to people and to kind of protect the people who have told their own stories in a way. And they realized that even though the most common trope that they saw was displacement, as you can see at the top right, there are many other elements that appear at the same time, including sexual violence, including stigmatization, persecution, and many other stories that they found. There are some of the covers of the comics that they've looked at. So that has become an important medium that has addressed these issues, and it has been able to reach other people. There's also other stories that have been used in the past. There's a famous animation film called Pequeñas Voces, in which children who had experienced the conflict made their own drawings, and they was turned into an animation that shows their experience of war. That's also an interesting one that kind of relates. And there have been other works of people trying to use comics as a way in which people can express what they felt during the conflict. Because I mentioned, it seems people take it much better than the distance that is created when things are only written or when things are only presented in journalist reports. And just to show you a more recent example, was winner of the 2023 graphic narrative, the city of Bogota. This El Sol No Es de Oro, which hasn't been published yet, I am in contact with both Santiago and Fernando, and this is the original cover that they presented for the award, and those are two of the pages. An interesting thing about this comic is that it includes no words whatsoever. I mean, apart from onomatopoeias like this one here, but in general, it would not include any dialogues. It's just all images, and it's expected to be published early next year, so that it would be in the International Book Fair in Bogota. But the interesting thing about this one is how, again, elements of the conflict are being represented in that kind of mixture of kind of reality and fantasy that has become quite common in all the other comics. And in previous work that I did with Daniel Aguilar, when we were looking at dystopian futures in Colombian comics, we had seen that there was a lot of elements of the conflict always being transported in that. And that one of our hypotheses at the end of our project was, if people were trying to extrapolate the problem of the conflict in the present, to always narrate the story from a dystopic future. So how that conflict has destroyed the lives of many, or how has that shaped the whole situation of the country as leading to a dystopia. So it was quite surprising to us when we were looking at that most of the comics actually took always this very dystopian narrative into the future. So so definitely, even though they only talk here about 45 different comics, the Colombian conflict has appeared in many other comics before that. And I would argue that nowadays it's probably through comics that you see most of the debates about the conflict, because of what it has enabled and how people can relate to comics in a way that they cannot relate to other forms, other media communication forms. So that's mainly it for the whole trip about the time continuum of comics. Other issues that have changed, obviously, is people who participate in comics and how they deal with the comic books nowadays, and the kind of new configurations that have been developed through time in who works in comics. Now, you have to remember that in Colombia, it's still not an industry that you can speak of. I mean, there's very small publishing companies that are the ones publishing comics. Perhaps the only large one would be Planeta. It's the only kind of large publisher that publishes comics in Colombia, but the other ones are small independent publishers. And then you have many that are what we call informal publishers. So those who do not have a registered company, but rather do it on their own, as their own work. And there are some of those that are considerably large now, but still it's more of an artisan thing. It's people present their own little creations, and they survive, or they work on other things to survive, but they have their comics as their interest. And they try to publish regularly, but that doesn't usually happen. Many of the works that have been created have never gone past the first issue. So that's just to give you an idea of the whole history of comic books in Colombia, and how that recently has connected a lot with addressing issues about the conflict, particularly since the peace accords of 2016.
Great, thank you very much. So time for questions now, plenty of time for questions. One thing that occurred to me while you were talking was, I mean, you know, obviously comics are a more accessible form for addressing issues around, you know, violence and so on, than a dry report or something. I mean, has there been any work on audience reception about how reader reacts to these ways of narrating violence and conflict and trauma?
There have been some in which people who have participated in either the creation or whose stories are being represented, they have been shown the final works, for instance, and most of them have really appreciated the way that those have come up. They feel like, since also the images help them connect a bit more with both their surroundings and their own feelings, they have appreciated that. So there's a lot of work in all of these cases in which people go, and as they draw, they bring that to the community and they show what they are developing and how they relate to that. Beyond that, so beyond those whose stories are actually being told, I don't know of any audience research thus far
Mhm.
that has covered how other people have read those stories
Mhm.
and how they have felt about them, which is something that is, I think it's one of the things that both Daniel and Jessica were presenting as the next step after the research that they've done on the comic books.
Right, okay. And another thing that was of interest, particularly to us because of the project, is the theme of race and racial difference, and which, as you know, in Colombia, since the 90s, multiculturalism and so on has become a big thing.
Yeah.
Can you say something about that and how important it is in the Colombian comic scene?
Well, definitely. So I will go back a bit, then just to return to. It's interesting to see in the case of Tucano that Tucano, which became this very important character, it's again the same story as Tarzan. It's basically a white boy from the street in Bogota who becomes the hero of the Tucano tribe. Yeah. So, and the same that we had, and that was basically the same story with Maku, as we saw here. That was also the case with Maku. Maku was also white, but living with this tribe and becoming kind of their hero. So that already shows you this idea of the white savior appearing in all of those stories. And even though Maku had one of his sidekicks being from the tribe, it was not the main character. So again, and the other thing is when you look then into the 90s, I don't know if it's over here in one of the colors, but later on you don't really see characters who are black or who are indigenous as being the heroes up until very recently.
Mm.
But you do see them now, and if you look, for instance, in Espectaculares Héroes Colombianos, and you see the color over there, although most of the main characters are white, the problem there is that the stereotypes that are taken there. So Kid, who is a superhero who's a boxer from the north and who's black, represents that kind of stereotype of the north, and because they're famous for boxing, then they represents that trope. And also the indigenous people who are part of the heroes, they're all kind of this mystic shamans that can, conjure spells and things like that. So it's always those, even those are trying to do a better representation, also draw on some of those elements. And Sambo Dende, which has become a really relevant cultural product, also taps onto that. So that character, which is supposedly the son of black father and an indigenous mother, and has this kind of special powers and helps free slaves during the time of colony in Cartagena. The creator of that story, as it has developed through time, has changed a lot of the elements because of that, because of tapping too much into the stereotypes of indigenous magic and black strength, which are kind of the main tropes that appear there. And it's quite interesting because in the last iteration of Sambo Dende, it is actually kind of a mystical character that appears in the dream of an Irish Mexican girl in California. So it has taken a very interesting turn of events. She's like the adopted daughter of a Mexican immigrant in California, and then she dreams of Sambo Dende. And it's in this connection with this character. So it's a bit more interesting in that sense that it starts connecting it other ways. In the case that because I worked a lot with the development of Sambo Dende, it's quite interesting because the creator wanted to turn it into action figures. And he was bringing it up to Mattel and saying like, look, you can turn Sambo Dende into an action figure. People from Mattel told him no. Because, if we create this freer of slaves, we need to create slaves. And we, no, that is not something that we're going to ever do, because you're not going to buy slaves, literally, as toys. So there you go. So that was part of the whole process in which you realize, oh yeah. And many of these things, as people come up and bring those issues out, become quite relevant. So yeah, certainly representations of race have changed through time, and you can see it through the comics, which is quite interesting, but definitely has taken a long time. And in the case of the ones that have been based on the discussions and descriptions of people for those comics about conflict, it's been much more interesting because it really gives you a whole other perspective, a whole other representation of people. But if you think about the work that was done by no, on my head, I think it's his name, when he was accompanying Orlando Falsborda in his trips, and the ones that he did with the people there when he was accompanying Orlando Falsborda, that is probably one of the best representations of race that you can find throughout comic book history. But it's interesting that the ones in the mainstream, if we could call that the mainstream Colombian comics, were clearly not representing the nation in that same way. It's very interesting, I must say, though, the case for the Fantomas one. That's actually very, very well done, because Fantomas goes actually to an area with indigenous people around the Orinoco River, and they did quite well. The way that people speak in that area is very well represented in the comic. The way that they address them as foreigners, in a way, I was quite surprised. I was really amazed on how well it was done. So the research for Fantomas was amazing in the case for Colombia, much better than many of the other same things, because as you can see, El Dago is white, and so was Maku. So in the case of those kind of heroes that were created, they were definitely taking the elements from the American comics. But yeah, this is at the same time as we had Memin Penguin, which was quite problematic as well at the time.
Yeah.
And I think we still have Nieves, which is still being represented in Colombian newspapers. So this image of a black woman.
Although she's now a philosophy student instead of a domestic servant.
Yes, now that has changed through time as well. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Kappa,
I'm wondering if you tell us more about the Truth Commission work with comics.
Mhm.
So I'm wondering if they establish a methodology to create these comics, if the artists work with the victims, because they seem really different to independent projects that approach the conflict. They seem like more neutral, like pedagogical in a way, and they also animated some afterwards. So yes.
Yeah, there's well, the work of the Truth Commission is a bit more complicated because of the way that they have to address the issue as well, and the negotiations that go along in the representation. So it's quite interesting as well. There's two studies about the comics that have been published by them, and it's very interesting just to see on those two studies how they address who is presented and how that part of the conflict is presented. In a way, obviously there's less description of certain of the complexities, particularly in showing the institution as problematic, the national, the state is problematic. It's a bit more difficult in all those comics that are institutionally supported. And there's a lot of debates of the people who were working there about how the national institution was being represented. But yeah, there was a lot of discussion about how these processes of gathering the information, of doing the research, and then doing the drawings and then sharing that had many different steps, and it was very different in the two kind of main ones. So from the Truth Commission was one way of approaching it, as opposed to the Center for the Historic Memory, because there were two different approaches, and you can see how there was certain political perspectives that were more that were stronger in one than in the other. So they're definitely different in the output that they have, and this is something that is also addressed by Daniel and Jessica in their article. Because as I said, that one is not published yet. That it's getting there. As you can see, it's going to be in comic form. So, but yeah.
So I don't know. I think there's maybe an assumption that it's easier to digest, say, sexual violence in a comic than it is in a film or a piece of art or something like that. I'm not totally convinced by that idea, but I am interested in why the Colombian state in different shapes and forms, or Colombian institutions, clearly are investing lots of money in supporting comics, and something that's not represented on the graph of sort of self-published versus published is who's putting the money up, right? And a lot of the time, things that are officially published by publishing houses are part funded by state organizations. So I'm quite interested in that shift between what happened that previously comics were pornography, in doing comics, to comics are now a fundamental part of kind of memory politics, say, in Colombia? Like, what shifted? And what also gets left out by that? Because it seems like there were also a lot of quite interesting underground works like zines and self-published mags that were borderline pornography, but quite radical in terms of their politics and things like that. And that obviously made the state pretty uncomfortable. But now they can promote this kind of work, and it's ironically, you know, it's quite easy to find comics and kind of the internal armed conflict. That's fine. We're okay with it. So I don't know. It's not really a question. But I'm sort of interested in that shift, if you like, that took place over the past couple of decades.
Yeah, I think there's a variety of elements that that play into that. One of them was when they were starting to reach into distant schools and addressing even things as indigenous languages. There's kind of a whole set of educational practices that have started to use kind of magazine type booklets. And that's basically in all of their new educational strategies to reach other areas. It's this kind of idea of the booklets. And eventually they did in the 90s a lot of tests with using comics as part of those booklets. So there was that movement within education that already kind of got it there. And I remember even in the 90s when they were developing right after the new constitution of 1991, and they were developing the new kind of communal associations that are able to manage some part of the budget for different regions. The way that they presented that to the people was through comics as well. So at that moment, it seems at first it was thought of something that could reach other areas of the country by being less dependent on text because of literacy. So the main issue was originally because of it's difficult to reach them because of literacy being so low in some of the areas. So if you use images, that might work better. And that started getting some momentum from the education side. On the other hand, there were a lot of debates from, as I said, the cultural, the Ministry of Culture after the Office for Culture in the 90s, because of this debate of academics saying, well, comics are certainly not, you know, like pornography. The problem that they had is this debate was always in art schools, and there were many different art schools that were debating this, but they were not really involved in law. As soon as they started getting the people from law involved, was that they developed this this question that was brought up to the Constitutional Court. So that's quite interesting as well, as to see to realize that you can argue that in in classrooms, or you can argue it among artists, as Bernardo Rincon had done since the 90s, but it is not brought up to other areas or to other disciplines as well. It doesn't move onto something more than just discussion, basically. So he needed to get that, because it's interesting that once the students, and these were students from two universities, Universidad Rosario and Universidad External de Colombia, who created kind of this the whole argument for it, and then the Ministry of Culture requested different universities to provide observations on that debate, and that was when they actually changed it. So there were many different steps, and I would also mention, well, the case of Entre Viñetas. Just the fact that Entre Viñetas started appearing as an event that attracted attention to other level, I would say, of people, mainly involving libraries, and libraries starting to understand comics not only as basic entertainment, but also as a way that more profound stories could be told.
It was also funded as part of a kind of literacy drive.
It was, yeah. So all of these things started always from that kind of literacy side of things, I would say. And as it got the ball rolling, that's why Entre Viñetas has more of a more elite or educated tint to it than the other things that have appeared, like the Shinanime in Cali, or all the things that have happened in Cali in the 80s as well. So Cali comics and all of those things, or the zines that appeared in Medellin, Gente Naranja, and those kind of things that were kind of a bit different in that aspect. So it was only when a certain elite of society started considering comics as something worth paying attention to, which is quite interesting as well, is how that comes about, because that is still a debate. And I've been in many of those debates in Colombia, when most of the people are interested and consider that the area which you should invest, and that's what you see here, is in graphic novels. And actually one of the debates working with the ones that have been developed by the institutions is that they turn out to be more of the graphic novel type of element rather than comic booklets. And it's because comic booklets still carry that stigma of not being culturally important enough, despite what people tend to say. And you see it in all of these events. And I think that's the main difference that you get between, and that's why I show it to you here, between Entre Viñetas and how Entre Viñetas, even though they talk about comics, there's very little about those kind of comics, those booklets and zines and that kind of thing. It appears there, but it's minimal in comparison to graphic novels. And what you see in Vigo, which is really kind of grassroots. This is a bit more kind of socially appealing because again, it has to be done through libraries. Libraries are the ones to allow to use their space for those kind of events. So, but they don't apply any censorship that I know of in any of these events. And I've seen some very, very strong and very difficult comics as well appearing in those events, which are quite interesting. But yeah, that would be my kind of general idea. I can't really say that it's the only reason why. But, yeah.
Is there a difference in like, because you say in the ones that you see in Entre Viñetas, it's more the structure of a graphic novel, also the length and the structure, but is there different themes that are explored in these more grassroots comics than the ones that are taken by, say, Planeta? Like, are there things that, Planeta is not really publishing?
Well, yeah, you would have more of a wider area of topics that would be covered by those magazines. I mean, that's the thing. You just have more variety of things. Some of them would be or would work and would appeal as well to Planeta. Some of them wouldn't. But the main thing is that the idea of the graphic novel also entails a certain kind of aesthetic approach to these comics. And some of the comics that you would see there might not make it in that sense, in that aesthetic appreciation of what is work, which is quite interesting because in the debates of the work of Paola, that would not have been the kind of aesthetics that would have been accepted for publication. So that's a very interesting case in which that implied a lot of other things happening at once of defining that, because I don't think that would have been published earlier because of the way that there was an expectation of how comics should look like if they were to be more relevant in that sense, or defined as worthy of note, which is something that you still see when you look at most of the graphic novels. You realize that they are different in that kind of style. In terms of topics, well, they are a bit more careful on certain topics and how they're presented. So there's a bit more. I wouldn't say that there's any form of censorship either, but there's a bit more concern for how things are presented. And then you would see in the scenes, which, as James has pointed out, there's some of them that are extremely graphic in whichever way you can imagine. And that is an actual debate that is very interesting. And I tell you from these WhatsApp groups, one of the main things that has been a big debate there is political correctness and issues of diversity. So many of the people who are there is like, no, I should be able to do in comics whatever I want. And no one should tell me that, representation should have an impact on how I draw, because they feel like they're kind of free of any external influence and they're just creating work that is artistic on its own right, and if not, it's censorship. So many of them are totally against it. Then you also have all of those who have worked also with commissioning from companies in the United States in particular, who don't like any governmental intervention. So who say we should not be applying for any grants from the government, and the government should not be messing up with that. And if anyone gets any grants from any organization, they should give it to us directly, not try to create events or whatever. So it's quite hard sometimes to see all of these debates because of of how entitled some of them feel about and the rights that they have.
What's the gender, racial, sexual profile of the group?
Oh yeah, you can definitely tell in that sense. Yeah. Well, in some cases you kind of tell because you only have phone numbers, and most of them don't have pictures, but rather drawings that they've created. But yes, that is definitely an issue that takes place in those debates. It's actually, I find it quite good that debate comes up there, because then you get to hear other voices as well on the debate. Yeah, on that intervention. And what comes out as more interesting is how they feel like there is or there isn't intervention. And obviously there are some who get certain advantages. So if I may, because I didn't, I guess I have to stop sharing and share it again. But then and that's what I did not show you before. Yeah. Can't really show them.
It's strange.
Yeah. Doesn't let me unhide the slides.